Hey, it's editing Ollie coming in. Just to let you guys know, we do bulk recording sessions because we have busy lives. But unfortunately, the Monday before this recording session, I tested positive for COVID. So to avoid spreading it, um, we decided to film or record. Separately for the first time ever. So there might be some odd feedback. Audio might not sync up quite right. We did the best that we could, but we just wanted to give you a quick disclaimer. I'm feeling fine, and next time things will be better. So, hope you guys still enjoy. Stay safe. Enjoy. Welcome to a Wild Mystery Podcast appears, where us dumb friends discuss mysteries, histories, and occasionally conspiracies. I'm your host, Ollie.
And I'm your co-host, Belle. Today's episode is going to feature the trigger warnings of driving under the influence, car accidents, chronic illness, discussions of microbes and gut stuff, and discussions of drugs, alcohol, and alcoholism. So if any of those topics are sensitive to you, I recommend that you check out any of our other episodes.
Yeah, and I did add the gut stuff trigger warning because I know, for me personally, this can be kind of rough to listen to sometimes. So I did try not to get too much into it because it makes me nauseous. So, but today we are going to be talking about Auto-Brewery Syndrome, which is a fairly controversial diagnosis even today. It's pretty big in the media, so you might have heard of it before, but let's talk about what it is and why some doctors and scientists are still skeptical about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, somewhere in the 1940s to 1970s, depending on which article you're reading, some interesting patients started to crop up in Japan. There were a couple case reports of patients who had issues with chronic yeast infections who were exhibiting signs and symptoms of alcohol intoxication, but they insisted they had not been drinking. I imagine that doctors must have been skeptical at first, but to their credit, they believed their patients enough to do further testing, and they ended up discovering that these patients had yeast overgrowths in their guts and an abnormal liver enzyme that made it hard for their bodies to get rid of excess alcohol. The theory was proposed that the yeast in their guts was fermenting carbs and sugars into alcohol, and the enzyme in their liver was slowing the process of getting rid of that alcohol. Thus, these patients became literally drunk on carbs.
Which is just insane, but so interesting.
Yeah. So let's do a quick little run through on how alcohol and getting drunk works, just so we can do a little deeper dive into how this theory works so we understand the basis. So our guts are filled with microbes, mostly bacteria, but 0.1% of the microbes in our gut are fungi, which yeast is, by the way, yeast is a fungi. Or yeast is a fungus, sorry. This is completely normal and good for us. We should not mess with the microbes in our gut unless they cause problems, but sometimes they can, and Auto-Brewery Syndrome is a decent example of that. Fungi feed on sugars and starches and produce carbon dioxide and ethanol as waste products. And ethanol, by the way, is the only safely consumable form of alcohol for humans, but the amount produced in a clinically average person's gut is so small and our livers are so efficient that it isn't ever an issue. But if you're drinking an alcoholic beverage, you're getting more than that amount of ethanol. You could say ethanol is like the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages.
Mm-hmm.
Is a byproduct of plant fermentation. So when a yeast ferments the sugars in a plant, it produces ethanol. So when we ferment malted barley, it becomes beer. When we ferment grapes, it becomes wine. Fermented potatoes become vodka, and fermented rice becomes sake. When you drink alcohol, some of it enters your bloodstream through blood vessels in your mouth immediately, and it continues to be absorbed into your bloodstream as it travels through your gut, because the point of your gut is to break down and absorb things to get them where they need to go. The more alcohol that makes it into your bloodstream, the drunker you are going to feel. Blood moves around your body pretty fast, so when alcohol makes it there, it will 2, and it will continue to affect your various body systems until your liver breaks it down and transforms it into other harmless substances. In your bloodstream, alcohol is going to make your blood vessels dilate or widen, which causes the blushing and kind of warm feeling that we often associate with drinking. Some makes it into your lungs, actually, where you breathe it out, but that's what is detected on breathalyzers, and it is also why your breath smells like alcohol if you've been drinking, which is interesting.
That is very interesting.
I didn't know that, yeah. In your brain and nervous system, it triggers the release of serotonin and dopamine, which are often referred to as our feel good hormones. So you're going to start to feel happier, more social and confident, less inhibited. It is also going to interfere with your brain's communications pathways, which will then lead to slurred speech, loss of coordination, blurred vision, dizziness, that kind of thing. Alcohol also triggers a few hormones and enzymes to be produced, but there is also an enzyme in our liver that turns alcohol into acetaldehyde, which makes you feel pretty bad when it starts building up in you.
Yeah.
Normally, there's an enzyme that turns ethanol into acetaldehyde, and then there's another enzyme that turns acetaldehyde into other harmless substances. But if you have less of that second enzyme, you can start to feel really sick from only a small amount of alcohol. Hypothetically, if you had Auto-Brewery Syndrome, you would notice more quickly if you were someone with less of that second enzyme. I don't know for sure if that second enzyme is the abnormal enzyme that sources are talking about when they refer to the Japanese cases, but it's theorized that the abnormal enzyme paired with the patient's high carb, rice rich diets is why Auto-Brewery Syndrome was first noticed in Japan, but that it could have been cropping up elsewhere and just not have been noticed.
It's a strong possibility.
Yeah. Auto-Brewery Syndrome is also known as gut fermentation syndrome or drunken syndrome. It's a proposed medical diagnosis where ethanol is produced through fermentation of carbohydrates and sugars by fungi or bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract, oral cavity, or urinary system. Patients present with signs and symptoms of alcohol intoxication, but insist they have not been drinking. In most cases, patients also report a high carb, high sugar diet and often have other chronic illnesses such as diabetes, IBS, Crohn's, short bowel syndrome, gastroparesis, or gastrointestinal diseases. In a lot of cases, patients trace their symptoms back to a round of antibiotics that some doctors speculate could have wiped out their normal gut flora and allowed yeast to overgrow. Diagnosis usually involves a combination of laboratory and observational tests with a detailed history of the patient, supplemented by family and friends wherever possible. Because the biggest thing in this illness is periods of intoxication. Patients can have trouble remembering their episodes or just not remember them correctly. So, this is one of those weird cases where a patient's doctor should look for supplemental information from loved ones. Lab tests usually include stool samples, endoscopy samples from the GI tract, or both to look for abnormal levels of bacteria or fungi. The observational test usually associated with Auto-Brewery Syndrome is called the Carbohydrate Challenge Test, and basically involves giving the patient a high carb meal and then testing their blood alcohol at regular intervals afterwards. This usually also involves keeping a careful eye on the patient to make sure they aren't sneaking drinks or being snuck drinks. Treatment is usually a combination of medications and dietary changes. To mitigate short term symptoms, patients are advised to stick to a low carb, high protein diet, which they will then slowly become less strict with as symptoms resolve. Medications usually involve antifungals and sometimes antibiotics. There have been a couple cases where chronic relapses occurred, and in some of those cases, treating an underlying disease, losing weight, or a stool transplant are helpful. A stool transplant, by the way, is exactly what it sounds like, introducing microbes from the stool of a healthy individual to the bowels of somebody with some sort of microbial abnormality. So I want to talk a little bit more in depth about what Auto-Brewery Syndrome looks like in patients that have been diagnosed with it. So let's talk about a couple of those patients. An unnamed 61-year-old Texas man who we are going to call Joe was admitted to the hospital in 2009 and blew a 0.37% on a breathalyzer. For reference, that's the equivalent of about 10 drinks for a 100-pound male. And
Wow.
yeah, 0.31% is where doctors usually start to get worried about alcohol poisoning, so he was absolutely at that point. In 2010, he was admitted to a hospital in Texas for a 24-hour observation where he and his family relayed his medical history. For 5 years leading up to this, he had been having episodes of dizziness, nausea, and fatigue, which his wife was actively taking notes of. At the hospital, doctors searched his bags to make sure he hadn't brought in any alcohol, and only doctors and nurses were allowed in to see him for his stay. He was fed a high-carb diet, and his blood was drawn every 2 hours to test his blood alcohol level. Despite being under strict surveillance and not given a drop of alcohol, at one point in the afternoon, his blood alcohol level hit 0.12%, the equivalent of 7 shots of whiskey for an average-sized man.
Holy shit.
In 2003, Ohio woman Karen Daw stumbled across an article about Joe while researching her husband, 39-year-old Nick Hess's symptoms. It had been about 10 years of him vomiting, having bad stomach pains and headaches, and having episodes where he just acted drunk. He described acting goofy and vulgar. He was aware he was acting drunk, and so was Karen, who at one point was so convinced that her husband was a closeted alcoholic that she searched the house for hidden liquor and couldn't find anything. Nick went through countless rounds of testing, was arrested and charged with a DUI at one point, but it was when tests showed that he had 400% more yeast in his gut than he should, that Karen was finally able to find that article on Joe, and she knew immediately what her husband was suffering with.
My God, 400%?
400%, yeah.
Ooh!
They, Karen and Nick, they contacted the doctors who had done Joe's case study, who then got them in contact with a doctor closer to them, who followed roughly the same treatment plan that Joe had undergone. Basically, just what we discussed earlier, antifungals paired with a low-carb diet. And it was immediately helpful. Although in 2015, he said he was still having an episode or two a month. He said he was leagues better than he had been and was so grateful to his wife for not giving up when he was ready to. Which is,
oh,
having been in a very similar situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in 2016, an unnamed Japanese man in his 60s, who we are going to call Haruto, blew a high breathalyzer after getting into a car accident. Somehow, doctors or police were able to confirm that he had not bought alcohol or drank within the last 12 hours. He was transferred to the gastroenterology department of the hospital, where he was having alcohol overdose seizures every 1 to 3 days, which is...
That's incredibly high.
Yeah. I think they must have suspected Auto-Brewery Syndrome from the jump, because they did tests and found no unusual flora in his gut, but they did find some yeast in his esophagus and stomach. Originally, he was diagnosed with Auto-Brewery Syndrome caused by esophageal candidiasis, which candida is a yeast, by the way. So esophageal candidiasis would be like an overgrowth of yeast in your esophagus. He was prescribed an oral antifungal gel, which stopped his seizures for the 7 days that he was on it. But then in 2020, he was rushed back to the hospital by ambulance, which is when they first had a suspicion that they'd never had before, that he could somehow have had oral Auto-Brewery Syndrome. After some testing, they confirmed the diagnosis and were able to see improvement in his symptoms after dental treatments, oral antimicrobials, and regular culture testings. By 2021, his seizures had not reoccurred, and he no longer had to use oral antifungals. So basically, the oral Auto-Brewery Syndrome is a proposed diagnosis. He is the only case that I ever found of this.
Wow.
Where,
that's crazy.
Yeah, where the overgrowth of yeast in your mouth would be what is causing the fermentation. So after all of that, it might be kind of tough to see how this is a controversial diagnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have people who have been observed not drinking and then testing high for blood alcohol content. So that's pretty convincing, you know?
Yeah.
Well, there are actually a lot of people with PhDs who are unconvinced. And to be fair, there are some pretty good reasons why. A lot of doctors and scientists, even forensic scientists, are skeptical because our livers are supposed to be able to handle the trace amounts of ethanol that are produced by microbes in our GI tract. For some of these scientists, they actually do accept the cases out of Japan where there was that abnormal liver enzyme, because they see those cases as the only cases where it's really possible. This is an especially compelling tidbit when you consider that any alcohol produced in the gut goes through the liver before making it to the bloodstream. So basically, if Auto-Brewery Syndrome is real, whatever a patient's blood alcohol level is, that isn't what is being produced in their gut. That is what is being produced in their gut minus whatever their liver already broke down. So you can see why some people are really skeptical from this angle, because to be blowing in some cases up to a 0.4% blood alcohol content, that's a massive amount of alcohol that is being produced in the gut.
Yeah, that, I mean, it's like, I can see where the doctors are coming from, where it's like, that's really not something that's a perceptible, but it's like, the thing is that I feel like some doctors don't always remember is it's like, people's bodies fight against them all the time. This isn't a new
Yeah.
thing.
Mm-hmm. Our bodies were designed by madmen, which means by evolution. But, here we are. The same group also has concerns because all this information on the diagnosis, symptoms, tests, and treatments, they are coming from case studies, not peer-reviewed studies. So basically, there are all these cases that have been written up on one or a few of the patients by one or a few of the medical professionals involved. Case studies are really, really great for new treatments or diagnoses, but they're not very strong from a scientific standpoint because they lack reproducibility. Because you can't reproduce it. If it's just like a person that came into the ER and you're writing up what happened,
Yeah,
you can't reproduce that.
exactly.
There are absolutely people trying to do these studies, but because it is such a rare diagnosis, it's kind of hard. Even scientists that fully believe Auto-Brewery Syndrome is real will tell you that there needs to be more research into it. It's just that these case studies are not definitive from an unbiased scientific standpoint, and it's so rare that it's really, really hard to get the amount of people that you need to do these big studies that are scientifically robust. The other things that make Auto-Brewery Syndrome controversial are basically what the diagnosis has been used to say by some people. There are a few cases of actual alcoholics trying to get away with DUIs or other charges by saying that they have it.
Of course.
Yeah. And there have been some full write-ups by some lawyers outlining why it shouldn't be accepted as a legal defense. And these usually involve things like reasons like, this isn't an accepted medical diagnosis. How do we confirm that somebody has it?
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, these lawyers are basically saying they shouldn't start a legal precedent by accepting it as a defense in every type. And there are a lot of cases where it has been denied as a legal defense.
As it should be, especially if people are lying.
Yeah. But there's also the idea that basically lawyers say, and I have some issues with this. There are lawyers that basically say, like, if you know that when you eat like a giant pizza, for example, that you start to feel drunk afterwards, then you shouldn't be driving after you've just eaten a giant pizza, right?
Exactly. It's like,
But like, on the one hand, if you haven't been diagnosed, who
who puts
eats a
that
couple slices
together?
of pizza? Like, if you haven't been drinking, are you really gonna sit there and think, oh, you know what? I bet I'm drunk because I just ate a pizza. You know? Like,
Exactly.
you know?
No one's going to put two and two
So
together
there's,
like that. It's not a logical step in the right direction from that.
yeah, so I do definitely see where lawyers are coming from in that situation. I can see where this can be really, really frustrating.
Yeah.
But then, like, I just think doing more research into the actual diagnosis would be useful in that situation. Besides that, there are some pseudoscientific beliefs. And I pseudoscience in quotes because I feel like that's generous.
Yeah, that's it,
um,
you know.
yeah. um, but some of these beliefs use Auto-Brewery Syndrome as proof for their bad and incorrect ideas. For example, there's this theory that we're all overrun with yeast. Yeast is everywhere. We got to get rid of all this yeast. And you can see where this diagnosis, an overgrowth of yeast in the gut leading to intoxication when you haven't been drinking,
Mhm.
can be something that these people latch on to.
Yeah.
So that we are all overrun with yeast is incorrect. And the fact that some of these people that are proponents of that incorrect idea are using Auto-Brewery Syndrome, it makes it
It makes it harder for with people who actually have it to be able to, like, get the help that they need to be able to resolve the issue.
and it also makes some people skeptical that it's even real. But it's an odd situation because I kind of feel like saying Auto-Brewery Syndrome isn't real because some people use it to confirm their bad ideas is the same thing as saying, "No, we don't have yeast in our guts," because some people use that fact to back up their pseudoscientific beliefs.
Yeah.
Like, but the fact that we have yeast in our guts is a scientific fact. Like, so I feel like that is not a particularly good reason why it's controversial, but it is a really good reason why you need to be extremely careful when researching Auto-Brewery Syndrome because a lot of these cases or this information comes from bad sources. And I think Google has learned enough about where I get my sources that I didn't see any of those until like the 10th page, but
Yeah, when you're, like, literally going into the dark web of Google.
yeah. At the end of the day, I am kind of torn on this. I usually go to sources like the Mayo Clinic, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association for things like this, but there wasn't anything on Auto-Brewery Syndrome that I could find in any of those places.
Mhm.
There have been case reports of kids as young as 5 with this diagnosis, but it's really hard to find the actual original original write-ups on a lot of these case reports. Like, I could not for the life of me find any information of the Japanese ones. And I went like super, super deep trying to. You can talk to my brother who I was on the phone with, like being so frustrated, like ready to throw my phone out or throw my computer out the window because I could not find anything. And I searched for hours, like trying to figure out, okay, what did these cases look like? Like, I know that there were write-ups, but I can't find them. I can't find them in Japanese. And I don't speak Japanese. So like
Yeah.
I was ready to use Google Translate and have like a shoddy translation, but I couldn't find them even in Japanese. Um there are a lot of people that are trying to do research into it though, so I'm pretty convinced that we will eventually know, but it could genuinely take a lifetime or longer.
Oh, I'm
I mean,
sure, yeah.
it was first noticed in Japan potentially as far back as the 1940s, and we're still pretty baffled by it here in 2022. If you think you might have symptoms or have been diagnosed, you can find a lot of resources online, but I do feel kind of uncomfortable giving much of it here because I don't know how much of it I trust out of these sources.
Yeah, well, and it's like it's hard to say if those,
Um,
like, sources have actually been, like, like I said, corroborated where it's like, "Hey, this is actually something where you can actually it's an actual resource that you can turn to, and I feel confident get
mhm.
sending you this direction."
Yeah, and a lot of these places that are like, hey, let us know if you have Auto-Brewery Syndrome, they're also the same people that are kind of skewing into the pseudoscience side of things.
Ah.
So I would, if you have any of these symptoms, like look up the case reports and contact the doctors that have done this before, because those are the same doctors that I would go to as well. And I'm sorry how useless that sentiment is, but here we are. So, what are your thoughts on Auto-Brewery Syndrome as a diagnosis?
I mean, I feel like it definitely needs to, like, be investigated more, but I feel like it's a really difficult thing when it's like, 1, it's a pretty
Mhm.
rare occurring, diagnoses, but also at the same time, I don't think it's fair to, like, as a clinician to be like, "Oh, this isn't real, this is just, like, secret alcoholics just, like, trying to get away with shit."
Yeah.
I don't think that's a fair diagnosis, strictly speaking, because it's like, I said it earlier in the episode, but it's like there are so many things that
Our
we
bodies
don't
do weird shit.
they do weird shit just because they can. I mean, hell, I know someone who's allergic to the cold. I know someone who's allergic to themselves when they're on their period. I know someone who's allergic to water. I know someone who's allergic to sunlight. Our
Mhm.
bodies are fucking weird, and there's no way to say without, proper research that this isn't just a thing. But just like
Mhm.
disregarding it completely is just like, I think it's naive,
Yeah.
and I think it's
And a lot
lazy.
of these doctors, yeah, and a lot of these scientists that are doing research into this, they are they're basically saying like, we don't want you to diagnose this. We just want you to like
Treat it.
give your patients the benefit of the doubt. Like keep an open mind and send them to us if you don't feel comfortable dealing with it. Like,
Exactly. And it's like, there's the one, what's it called? There's a specific, I don't know if it's a disease, a syndrome, like, I don't know what they define it as, but there's one where it's like they can't feel physical pain.
mhm.
And like, a lot of people thought that was bullshit for the longest time.
Yeah.
So it's just
I
like,
think
you have to give it a chance to be able to be investigated. And granted, I do think that's something where it's like, when one of these cases come up, if they do actually contact the Mayo Clinic and are like, hey, you need to get somebody out here, we have a probable case of Auto-Brewery Syndrome. And so that we can go ahead and investigate it and figure out as much as we can.
yeah. And I think it's also tough because like there's a lot of doing doing studies in like in a lab, not in a human body, not in a body at all. So like out of tests like labs out of petri dishes and that kind of thing. They are really really tough in cases like this cuz I mean the best example of this is like bleach will kill cancer cells in a petri dish. In a human body,
Bleach will
bleach will
kill the
kill the
human.
human body as well.
Yeah.
So like doing things in petri dishes don't translate directly to
Patient care.
like yeah, patient care. But also it's usually where you start with a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you do a test on whether this is possible when the petri dish doesn't have a liver and doesn't have like I mean cuz
Because then it,
you can put
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeast in a petri dish and then put carbs or sugars in the petri dish and watch it ferment into ethanol. But how do you test and like this is probably just me being ignorant about how this tests work because there probably is some sort of way that you can measure and like test whether or not it's actually but okay, but it's not like this just doing stuff in a petri dish does not mean that things are possible in the human body. And this is a really
And
good example of how
the
hard
converse
it
is true
can
as well.
be. Yeah. So like it's just really hard to figure out how to do tests on this and that's I think where a lot of the controversy comes from
Yeah.
because it's just hard and I mean the other thing a lot of this is the way that you avoid trying to get like the way that you try to avoid getting Auto-Brewery syndrome is to avoid taking antibiotics unnecessarily, which is a good rule to follow anyway.
Mm-hmm.
If you are ever prescribed antibiotics, take them the way that they are prescribed to you, take the whole course. But and we're going to talk about I'm sure eventually we're going to talk about other cases where antibiotics they are antibiotics are great, but also they
In
can be really really
moderation
rough on your
and
body
as prescribed by a
and taken
physician.
correctly. And when we first discovered antibiotics, we were overprescribing them, overtaking them. That's how we have these resistant bacterias
Like
and things.
MRSA.
Because yeah. Um so but I think also that we when things brush up against the pharmaceutical industry, it is hard to get funding on testing them. If like because the treatment for Auto-Brewery Syndrome isn't going to make the pharmaceutical industry a lot of money. And who is funding these studies? It's not hospitals, because hospitals don't have money.
No.
It's it's pharmaceutical industries.
Exactly.
In a lot of cases, pharmaceutical industries are funding these studies. And I mean, I'm not saying it's only pharmaceutical industries, because there is funding coming from
There is
other
outside
resources.
funding
It's just that,
sources.
like,
However,
so much of it does come from pharmaceutical industries, and, like, how do you navigate that with a diagnosis? Because you see this in stuff like, you can't really nobody's going to fund a study on whether elderberry actually helps the common cold, because you don't make money off of elderberry, you know?
yeah,
And
it has to be something that's going to have a return on investment for the companies that are
and
funding the
when
research, because otherwise it's not profitable to them, despite the fact that the profit should be
human life.
human life and the improvement and betterment of human life.
Yeah.
But that's a
But then,
conversation
you
on
know,
ethics and moral.
yeah. And it's just like, when you have a case like Auto-Brewery Syndrome, where the most accepted treatment is dietary changes, that doesn't make people money.
Nope.
That doesn't make pharmaceutical industries money. And, like, usually they are being supplemented by antifungals and antibiotics, usually antifungals, but they're always different, you know, and there haven't been enough studies to have a, like, golden standard treatment,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it's,
So,
it's like the same case I was referring to earlier, like the no pain thing. It's like, how many cases of that are there in the world? It's
yeah.
exceedingly rare.
Mhm. And this is another one of those cases where, I do tend to lean towards that it's real, and we're just at the very, very beginning stages of understanding it.
Mhm. Oh, I
But
completely agree with you. I think Auto-Brewery Syndrome is an actual thing, and it just hasn't had the opportunity to be investigated. I mean, if you look at, like, because it honestly could kind of be classified as basically, like, well, I wouldn't say autoimmune disorder because it's like a completely separate thing, but it kind of falls into a similar category with that. Psoriasis is an autoimmune disorder, um, which which can cause the it increases the skin cell production rate. The normal skin cell production rate of a typical person is 28 days. For people who have been diagnosed with psoriasis, it's like can typically be from 3 to 7 days. So it's a rapid reproduction
damn.
of cells, and so what that causes is red inflamed areas um, that are scaly in nature due to the overproduction of skin cells in affected areas. With that being said, psoriasis can actually also affect your cholesterol because psoriasis causes inflammation, and cholesterol measures the amount of measures inflammation, and that's all that
Mm,
is. So, but it can also affect other things, like you can have like psoriatic arthritis. So it's just one of those. But there is no cure for psoriasis.
mhm.
There's only treatments that are available. And yes, there's a lot of medication for that, and the medication
Yeah.
is wildly expensive. For example,
Jeez.
like insulin is to diabetics. It is incredibly
Oh,
expensive.
great, yeah. Or EpiPens are to people who will die without them.
Yeah, people who go into anaphylaxis. It's the you know, and for example, psoriasis and eczema have been, and diabetes and even cancer have been around for an incredibly long time, but the amount that we know about them is severely underrated. We don't know enough. And that's just because we're still learning as a as a world. We're still learning as
Mhm.
a healthcare. We're still learning as a healthcare team.
There's a lot of stuff we don't understand about the body, and,
Hmm.
honestly, there's the gut and the stomach
I think it's one of the least
are
understood.
yeah, and we're starting to understand, like, how much I've had a lot of stomach problems in my life for the listener, and there's a lot of we are starting to understand for the first time how much of like, our emotions are tied to the gut. So, like, for the 2 of us who have had panic attacks, my panic attacks they manifest about half the time in just, like, severe, severe nausea, like, knock you over nausea, like, um, puking, that kinda thing. I actually usually don't puke, but it's to the point where I, like, lift the toilet lid and am ready to, you know? That's how most of my panic attacks manifest. Then when I was talking to a doctor at the Mayo Clinic at one point, and she asked it was a class at the Mayo Clinic, um, she asked the class, like, "You see say you're on the street and there's a kid in front of you. You see somebody stop in their truck and come out and grab the kid. Where do you feel that reaction first? Do you feel it in your head or do you feel it in your stomach?" Like,
Yeah, and you feel it in your stomach because you get
yeah,
your body reacts emotionally, and that creates nausea.
that's you get things like, "I felt a pit in my stomach. I felt my stomach drop. I felt,"
My stomach
you
turn,
get sayings like that.
it's I
Yeah,
I was nervous and it felt like my stomach was flip-flopping.
yeah. But we and as a scientific, the scientific community understands we feel emotions with our stomach sometimes. But why?
Yeah.
How?
Exactly. Well,
So,
and
like,
it's like, and even not even necessarily emotions, because when I get
yeah.
overheated, I
Oh,
for
yeah.
me, that's what presents my nausea the most, is if I get overheated, I get so nauseous and I immediately
When
have to
I
cool down.
Yeah, when I had gastroparesis, which we will talk about gastroparesis at
Another
some
day.
point. There will be an episode on it.
don't need
When
a
I
don't
think
need a
I can
2 hour
handle
episode.
it emotionally,
Don't
I will do an episode on it.
don't need a
But,
2 hour episode.
yeah. Oh god, yeah, it will be so long. So much of my, like, anxiety is tied to trauma from gastroparesis, and I'll write a book on it someday. It'll be great. But it's, like, I don't even remember what I was gonna say. Oh, when I had gastroparesis, like, it is an accepted diagnosis, which it's exactly what it sounds like. It is, your food sits longer in your stomach than it is supposed to. Your stomach doesn't process food, um, as quickly. So, for example, after, like, 7 hours, I think, when I had the test, you're supposed to have, digested it's something like 60 or 70% of the food in your gut. Like, it's a pretty decent amount, but it's not all of it.
Yeah, and you had to only
I
process
had
like 4%, wasn't it?
It was 8%, yeah. So, um and that will also be a mystery episode because my last doctor, gastroenterologist, before the gastroparesis, like, I was declared gastroparesis free, he actually, when he saw my test results, he was somebody who had done a lot of the research into the medication that I was taking, into gastroparesis, into all of that stuff. Um, and when he looked at my results, he actually told me and my mom that, like, because I think I was a minor at the time. I'm not totally No, I wasn't. But he told us he if at the time he had been the one who had done the diagnosis, he would not have immediately diagnosed me with gastroparesis. He would have done more digging because he wasn't 100% sure that my results were
Indicated.
gastroparesis. And the thing about that is that a lot of the research that I was doing into Auto-Brewery Syndrome, I kept going, "Oh, that I've experienced that." And then going, "I can't be thinking about this," right? Like, so but I mean, I feel like there are a lot of similarities between Auto-Brewery Syndrome and gastroparesis because it is something that it is primarily dietary changes and lifestyle changes
Mhm.
that are used to treat it. You use, uh, medications to supplement that. Um, it's not very well understood. It hasn't been a ton of research on it. Obviously, there's been more into gastroparesis. We don't understand why they happen. They primarily affect your gut. They have a lot of the same symptoms, minus obviously gastroparesis. You don't get intoxicated, but there's like my point that I was trying to make about gastroparesis is that this is a diagnosis that has been around, I think, much longer than Auto-Brewery Syndrome. I mean, it has to be.
Yeah.
It's a diagnosis that we have accepted treatments for. We have accepted as like a real diagnosis. The Mayo Clinic has a page on gastroparesis,
Mhm.
but we don't know why it happens. We don't know, like, we have accepted treatments for it, but they aren't perfect. You
Yeah.
know, there's so much about our gut that we just don't understand that I can see how a lot of it's kind of like how it's like I can see sea monsters existing because we don't know a
We
whole
don't
lot
know
about
about the depths
our
of the
ocean.
ocean. Yeah.
So like when GI gastrointestinal diagnoses come up, I am more inclined to believe them because
We just don't have the
I feel
information.
like it's yeah, I don't feel like we fully understand how the gut works. And especially like I'm taking medical classes. When I was taking them, most of the information on the gut was like we, this is how it breaks down food and, memorize the sections of the intestines and the sections of the stomach and stuff. It didn't go into like it didn't go into a lot of this. It didn't go okay. I understand more about the stomach than the average person does because I've had so many issues with mine.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of stuff in my classes, my biology and physiology classes that didn't cover some of the stuff that I already knew just from having a bad stomach. So like and to be fair, that it was like a week that we were focusing on the stomach. So two classes, they didn't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
But there's I could talk about this for hours. So we should probably stop, but I just think
Yeah. I hear you.
I can see where people are skeptical about Auto-Brewery Syndrome, but
Oh yeah.
I tend to lean towards that this is a real diagnosis that we just don't understand yet.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, from my experiences listening to first of all, the podcast Sawbones, I used them for some of the information in this episode because they did an episode on it. It is run by a doctor and her husband. They talk about medical history. They don't give medical advice because that would be sketchy. I mean, not
It.
it wouldn't be advisable.
Yes.
But like they did an episode on this and she talked about kind of the oh my god,
Basis.
how doctors view
Mm.
Auto-Brewery Syndrome. She talked about how when she was first hearing about it, a lot of it was like doctors going, "Oh, alcoholics trying to get away with their alcohol, like they're in denial and blah blah blah." Which, to be fair, part of alcoholism is that you do not accept that you are an alcoholic at first. In order to get better, you have to first accept that you are an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have trouble with that first step. But there are so many of these cases where people straight don't drink.
Mhm.
Like, and I mean, this is when you're having gut issues, as somebody who's had gut issues, drinking is one of those things that I completely stopped when I had gastroparesis. Well, I was diagnosed when I was 17, so when I was 17 or 18. So I wasn't drinking that much anyway, but I also just when I did have it past 21 and I I still really wasn't drinking, because when I woke up and I was nauseous, I wanted to know that that was the gastroparesis and not that I had drunk too much the night before. And I didn't feel like, if I had the gastroparesis, I did not feel like I was in a position to figure out where my limits for alcohol consumption were.
Yes.
So there are a lot of these cases where people have had GI issues, they've had other, issues similar to that, where I would personally say alcohol affects your stomach so much, and you want to know whether you drank too much or whether it's whatever your stomach issues are, that a lot of them just, you don't drink as much when you have alcohol problems. And that's a generalization, obviously.
You mean gut problems?
I'm sure a lot of people, gut problems. What did I say?
You said alcohol problems?
Whoops.
I mean, yes, but I figured you meant gut problems.
But I'm inclined to believe that a lot of these people who are already having, and I mean a lot of these symptoms, because again, this isn't just that you are getting drunk on carbs. This is an overgrowth of yeast in the gut, and that causes other issues. There are other symptoms associated with it, and a lot of them include like nausea and vomiting. So when you already have those symptoms, I personally don't like to drink a lot when I have those symptoms. And I think that there are a lot of people who also feel that way. I think it is getting more accepted by doctors recently, tentatively accepted.
Yeah.
But there's still some, they are right that there needs to be more research into it.
Oh, absolutely.
And unfortunately, it's just, that's going to be the biggest hurdle. So
I completely agree.
This has been a discussion on Auto-Brewery Syndrome, a diagnosis proposing the possibility that certain people can get drunk on carbs due to an overgrowth of microbes in the gut. This is a Wild Mystery Podcast, Pierce. I'm Ollie.
And I'm Belle. You can go to our website at awmpa.com to get all of our social media and find our other episodes. We hope that you found this episode interesting and enlightening, and we'll talk to you next Thursday. Stay safe.